Okay, great. It's almost time to start here. We're letting everybody get on. So we will start in a minute. All right, everybody, we're going to start. We're going to give about another minute for everybody to trickle on as they continue to come on. And we will then. Good, Tim, you're showing your screen. Good. Good. Let's go back to the other screen now. Tim, can you unshare your screen so we can have our introductions? And then after we do our introductions, then I'll let you turn that back on. Perfect. All right, Craig, can you put up the front screen for me? We're gonna give another 30 seconds. Good. I think we're gonna get started. It's right about 10:01 right now, so everybody should be on. If not, people will be trickling on as we're going along. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. This is a great pleasure for me to continue our series of education with Trazer. I'm Randy Cohen. I am the Vice President for Clinical Education and Elite Performance at Trazer. And it's my pleasure to introduce and listen to Dr. Tim Hewett, today. And, Dr. Hewett, for those of us who are in the field of sports medicine, we don't probably need to introduce, Dr. Hewett to us because what he's done has made such an impact. He is a professor and director in the Marshall University Department of Orthopedic Surgery at the School of Medicine. He is a pioneering researcher and leader in the field. He's held multiple leadership positions at Mayo Clinic, at Ohio State, the Ohio State University. Apologize for those Ohio State people. The Ohio State University and Cincinnati's Children's Hospital. He's worked collaboratively and lectured and been keynote speaker all across the world. He has over 500 peer-reviewed journal articles that he has out there. I looked him up this morning, and his citing is over 81,000 citations on Scholar Google. If you look at that, when you see that, I've looked up other people, and I don't know if anybody who has more than Tim. So, but most importantly, if you kind of look at him and you know him well and you've spent time with him, he's got some great YouTube videos of him being the lead singer, doing some great rock and roll classics, rock classics such as Tuesday's Gone and Knocking on Heaven's Door and Give Me Three Steps, and he's a heck of a singer. He's fun to be around, and loves doing karaoke, and so we're excited to have him. And this is a great introduction for us. For continuing to promote what we're doing at Trazer, but more importantly, to educate, to really help prevent injuries, and to allow athletes and people, more functional people, to get back, to prevent injuries, to prevent chronic problems, and also really to return after injuries and be safe when they return. And so we'll have questions and answers at the end. And they say Randy's questions, but I said, well, we're going to have so many clinical questions from the audience. I'm going to probably jump right into those. And I always have, Tim and I love to talk. So it's when I have questions on him, I just pick his brain, and I learn an incredible amount. So what we do is put in the chat, start putting questions into the Q&A early. If it's a question that pops up and you don't think he's going to hit the topic on it, put it in early so we have those right away so we can jump into those, because I think the Q&A for people is as important as Tim's quick presentation to start. So, well, Dr. Hewett, I'm going to let you share your screen. Craig's going to turn off our screen, and then you can share your screen, and I'm going to let you move ahead.
Thank you so much, Randy. Thank you very much for the extremely kind introduction. And yes, I'm heading next week to Japan, and I'm going to karaoke my brains out. I will have absolutely no voice left. So you're catching me at an opportune moment. So Randy tasked me with talking about osteokinematic measures in ACL injury prevention and return to play and function. I am a so-me guy. I am not shy, as you can probably tell already. So come visit me. I have 3 different Twitter accounts, and they actually troll one another and argue with each other. So I try to be somewhat entertaining. And please join my YouTube and subscribe, as I really enjoy interacting and putting up the latest work. So I think what we need to do first is start out with our mission. And they tasked me to put together a mission statement for our research in orthopedics here at Marshall. And basically what we're after is producing the highest quality research, using the latest, highest quality technologies like Tracer, educating the public on the latest research advancements, and most importantly, translate them into clinical practice. And when Randy brings up those 80,000+ citations, that's why we have those, because we've been able to do that, actually translate. Otherwise, if you do the research and you don't educate and you don't translate, really, what's the point? So I'm out there, constantly traveling. I'm on the road about a third of the time, just promoting our mission and our results, both internationally and on SoMe. And again, this is where you can find us, and this is where you can find our crew as well. Marshall, Dr. Chad Lavender is one of our ACL surgeons who pioneered the fertilized ACL, and John Jasko is our head of sports medicine, is also somebody to follow on social media. So our research philosophy is using a pyramid-based approach. And the idea is we start out with what I call good old Abe, and which is anatomy. Studying you've got to know your anatomy, especially if you're in orthopedics and sports medicine. Start with anatomy, move into biomechanics, and then from there, epidemiology. And you're going to focus in the orthopedic and sports medicine realm on different surgical techniques, repairs, reconstructions, and then look at clinical outcomes. So I love this quote from one of my favorite presidents. I love both Lincoln and Jefferson. And basically, the best way to predict your future is to create it. And again, I'm just reminding you, start with good old Abe, anatomy, biomechanics, and epidemiology. So this is important. So especially when you get into these technologies, there's lots of technologies out there to choose from. It's overwhelming now. And Tracer is one amazing option. But there are a lot of wearables out there, and a lot of people are using these things. And my fear is that they're letting these wearables drive their questions rather than letting their questions drive their tools. So let's not let our tools drive our questions. Ask the most important questions and do it in a way with experimental design that's going to answer those questions appropriately. So first, you're going to want to examine your approach. Are you asking the right question? Are you designing your experiments to properly, and are you going to come out with a yes or no answer to that question? And again, this problem with wearables and other technologies that everybody's getting into is just because you have a hammer, everything is not a nail. Just because you're in the NBA and you have some wearable doesn't mean you need to sit out players. So in order to answer these questions, we have to have the proper research technology and mindset. And I like to go through T3. And this, I teach this to all our fellows, our faculty, our residents, our medical students. T3. These are my tips, my tricks, and my traps. Yep. So first of all, tips, passion for the project. Allow 1 hour a day, get started as soon as possible, do your IRBs, do your CIT training, match your skill to your skill set, take on existing projects, take on existing IRBs, do a project that doesn't require an IRB, traps, time, procrastination, inappropriate prioritization. Research shouldn't always come last. In clinical practice, research is of the utmost and highest importance. So the ACL. So the ACL is this little guy here, it's basically proportionate to the first two digits on your pinky. Believe it or not, I've spent the last 3 decades studying this little guy. It's actually kept me quite busy. It is, especially to anterior movement, which is primarily what we're doing in many sports. It's the primary stabilizer to anterior translation of the tibia relative to the femur. It is responsible for the most time lost in the NFL. There's between 100 and 2,000 per year. So escape. So they're telling me that I don't have my slide up. Are you guys there?
Yes, just
Yeah,
do a screen share, Tim, like you were done earlier. There you go.
Oh, okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep. Sorry about that. Let's see.
yeah, just hit your run presentation. Now there you go. Thanks.
Okay, so the ACL is the primarily stabilizer of the knee joint, and it's about a $3 billion a year healthcare cost. Second ACL injuries are a big concern of ours and a big thrust of ours. It's about 20 to 40%. And it's, although it's relatively rare, if you look at young female athletes, say at high school level and college level, they're at risk. We say, wow, they're really high risk. Well, they're at risk in the range of about 3 to 6%, which is too much, but it's still relatively rare. Young males match per age in the range of about 1 to 3%. So again, relatively rare, but it's devastating. And when you get it, you're out for a long period of time. It leads to a loss of significant participation. So the incidence, it depends. There was a study done by Doug Jackson and JBJS in the early 2000s, said about 100,000 per year. The manufacturers, the surgical manufacturers, say no. They estimate it's around 350,000 because that's how many ACL kits are sold per year, surgical kits. So it's somewhere in between there. Let's say in the range of about 250,000 annually. The interesting thing about ACL injuries is about 70 to 80% occur in non-contact situations. Now, what that tells us is we have an opportunity. We have an opportunity for risk reduction. I don't like the term prevention because prevention says, I know something's going to happen and I'm going to stop it from happening. We can't pick out specific athletes. We can't pick out an athlete and say, this athlete is definitely going to have an ACL. What we can do is reduce the relative risk in populations. And I'm going to talk about how much, but basically between 50% by half to 67% or by 2/3 because 70% occur in non-contact situations due to neuromotor control glitches. So this gives us an opportunity. So females are reported, depending on the literature, anywhere between 2 to 10 times greater risk than males. And there's a lot of potential reasons for this. And we've written endless studies. The first that we wrote on this was in Sports Medicine in 2000. Suggested risk factors: anatomic, hormonal, biomechanical, neuromuscular. The reality is all of these probably contribute at some level, but biomechanical and neuromuscular are the modifiable ones. And we've demonstrated again and again and again that we can not only change those, but when we change those, we can reduce risk. So it was interesting. Last year was the 50th year in 2022 of both AOSSM, which is the American Orthopedic Society for Sports Medicine, and the American Journal of Sports Medicine. Most people don't realize that the discipline of sports medicine is relatively young. It's 50 years old. And so interestingly, at the 50th anniversary at the AOSSM meeting, they had a large celebration of this and an AJSM, and they looked at the over those 50 years, the top cited paper of each year over each of those 50 years. And our work was one of the top 5 out of the top 50 for each year was the top cited paper of that year. How do you have that kind of citation success? Through a pyramid-based research approach as we're going through right now. So the background to this, I have 6 sisters. About half of them were better athletes than I was. I was very much interested in sports and sports medicine. As a PhD, I actually came out of cardiovascular biophysics and moved from a cardiology and a molecular biology and biomechanics department into sports medicine at Cincinnati Sports Medicine, actually. And I just went across the street. I was at University Hospital and went over to Deaconess Hospital and went to Frank Noyes there. And I said, hey, I'd love to get involved in sports on the research side of this. And I became the research director there over the 90s. And the surgeons there were very much interested in to do a project up north of town in Mason, Ohio. At that time, it was called Soccer World. And to do injury epidemiology is challenging. It's challenging to determine who gets injured, absolutely. So you have to have your athletic trainers in place and on site. So we did. So out at Soccer World, there were multiple indoor AstroTurf fields, and there were the same number of outdoor grass fields. So the hypothesis we wanted to test with the help of our athletic trainers who were there and basically monitored every single match was, are there more injuries on AstroTurf than on grass? Now, this was a serendipitous question in itself, because our surgeons thought, we think with it, this was a different kind of turf back then. This was AstroTurf. This was this, and I'm sure, Randy, you may remember this hard plastic AstroTurf. And so our surgeons thought with that harder landing, with given more force, you're going to have more ACLs. They just had the impression that there were more young people coming in playing soccer and having ACLs on AstroTurf. So we did the study. Now, again, epidemiology, it's hard to figure out the numerator, how many people get injured. That's the tough part. We could do that. We had an athletic trainer at every match. Now, we had other advantages out there on this site, which was that each and every match was an hour long. At the end of an hour, the match ended, and whoever won. And the athletic trainers were measuring the length of time, which was 60 minutes. And we had co-ed leagues there that we were following. And because they had to have at least half women, that meant every match had exactly half women. So when we looked at the data, the hypothesis we were testing didn't pan out. We didn't find it, that we had to accept a null hypothesis. There was not a difference between AstroTurf and grass. So we're looking at this massive amount of data that we've collected and thinking, we put all these athletic trainers to all this work, spent all this time on this, and you're telling me there's no difference between AstroTurf and grass. And that is the case at that time with AstroTurf. Now, this is different with the new rubberized turfs. There was a study done around 2014, 2013 in AJSM by the pro football, the NFL team docs, that showed that the risk of an ACL injury was about 62% higher on the new rubberized turfs versus grass. But in this study, no difference between AstroTurf and grass. But this was serendipitous, and I really like this finding because it was unexpected. So as soon as you develop a hypothesis and you test it, you've biased yourself. You've biased your collection because you're saying, I'm guessing this is what we're going to see. We didn't guess this is what we were going to see at all, actually. And what we saw when you looked at females who were exactly half this population, it just slammed you in the face that they were 6.2 times greater risk than males, whichever turf they were playing. And now this was in the early 90s. So this was actually not a politically correct finding. Remember, so we were only 20 years into Title IX, where the U.S. government passed a law that said we have to give equal and opportunity and time and money into female athletics as male athletics. And we were finding something that said, oh boy, females were at significantly higher risk than males. And actually, this was interestingly, these studies, actually multiple of these studies of ours through the 90s were used in a Supreme Court case where they used our data to say, see, look at the downsides of Title IX funneling girls and women into sports, which is not correct at all. It was actually, they were challenging that what they did, instead of increase opportunities for, as so often happens for females, they decreased opportunities for males, like dropping wrestling programs in college. And that's what that was about. But this was not very politically correct. We had actually a hard time publishing it. And we said, man, has anyone ever seen this before? So I looked back in the literature, and I thought what was at the time, because I'm a Mason-Dixon line guy. I grew up in Southwest Ohio near Miami University's campus. And I looked and found this journal called the Southern Orthopedic Association, and found a study by the group at Duke, and Terry Malone, who's now a good friend of mine, reported in there, and they looked at males versus females in college basketball, Big Ten, and the now sadly defunct Pac-10. And what they showed was that females were at 6.18 times greater risk than males in college basketball of having an ACL. Now, this was mind-blowing. Now, this is what I love about science. Not only was this serendipitous in that this is not what we were looking for at all, which is great because we didn't have any bias in these findings. We knew there were true findings, but we also found consilience in the data, and consilience is what I love, which is throwing all the data points on a wall and seeing where they intersect, see where the same. So almost the exact same number from a totally different set of athletes and different researchers. That tells us that this data is real. So this led us into a whole series of studies. So this is from basically 1994 on. So for the last 30 years, that led me to studying this little ACL, the first two digits of your pinky. And what we questioned next was, what's going on? Why is there this difference? And more importantly, how could we reduce the risk of females relative to males? So I'm an old-time power lifter. I still train with my son on a regular basis. Really, another thing that's been just a blessing in my life, to have my son grow up and be my training partner. And I'm one of those crazy dads. He started training plyometrics with me when he was about 3 or 4. And you should see his calves. Anyway, if you look at the biomechanical correlations, what we said was, what's the difference? So we looked at landing forces, we looked at biomechanics, and we didn't have the tools. We actually looked across the board. We looked at motion and 3D motion analysis. We looked at every tool. So again, as a basic scientist, what I did is I put a lot of tools in my tool belt so that I could answer the relative questions, not letting the tools push my questions, let my questions utilize the tools. And basically what we found with a 8-week training program was that we could, basically what this was a lot of mid-level to high-level plyometric training. And it was strength training too. There was a strength component to it. So there was resistance training, a lot of plyometrics, and a lot of progressive plyometrics. Each week we would keep progressing the plyometrics, start out with double leg, move into single leg, then come back to double leg with near perfect technique. And what we showed was the athletes kept getting more powerful, importantly, relative to their body weight. Their vertical jump went up. And the surgeons actually hypothesized, they said, we think the reason females are different is because they land with straight legs. So we think so that's a long-standing hypothesis that females or people at high risk land with a straighter knee. That's not what we saw. And that's where we were looking. So we were looking in the sagittal plane. We expected flexion and extension, that the females were going to land more extended. They didn't actually. What they had was a lot more dynamic valgus. So an external abduction moment. And the reason, so from biomechanics, we're calculating from the foot segment up. So what we're seeing when we say abduction, we're saying the distal tibia is abducting away from the midline of the body. And what we showed was females had significantly more dynamic valgus, or more properly termed external abduction load, than males. But what we also showed with this high level plyometric training, that we could reduce that load to the same level as males. So this led to the first top-cited article of the year in 1996, this plyometric training. And basically what we showed is that we decreased the impact forces significantly, we increased the hamstring torque, we decreased the valgus torques. So importantly, when you look at motor control, it's very important that you monitor it, the levels of proprioception, neuromuscular control. And we know that deficient neuromuscular control may contribute to first injury risk. And so how do we know that? This is what we did next. So we did the same series of studies using the same techniques. And what we showed is that, and this is really interesting. This is in 1999. So we tailored the biomechanic training to the athlete. And what we did is reduce the risk of all serious and injuries by 50%, and we reduced non-contact ACL injuries by 2/3. This was the top-cited article of 1999. So we knew that these neuromotor deficits and biomechanical aberrations that we saw that made athletes high risk, if we altered them, we could, in the gym and in the laboratory, that we could reduce that risk significantly in the field. So we showed that there was this connection of individuals at high risk for ACL rupture. And basically what we did is this is the lab at Ohio State where we did these coupled biomechanical epidemiologic studies. And it's also important that the tools that you use are valid, that they're reliable, they're reproducible. So for example, I had students and was doing research at this time in the 3D motion analysis lab at Ohio State, at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and we're also working at the team at the University of Kentucky. And we took a whole group of girls from Mason, Ohio, the same place where Soccer World was, and we tested and retested them and showed the validity and published the validity, reliability, and reproducibility of our 3D biomechanical findings in journals where we looked at that the data from all three labs was similar. And then we let the girls go out and play. What we showed was, as we tracked these kids after we tested them biomechanically, we showed that these same biomechanical underpinnings that we could alter with plyometric training actually increase the risk of a future ACL injury. So this is multiple hundreds athletes. This is about a 200 athlete cohort that we started out with. And we showed that relative to uninjured athletes, injured athletes had about 9 degrees more distal tibial abduction and about 10 degrees less flexion than those who don't go on to that first primary ACL injury. And we showed that we could actually categorize this. And this was over a series of several studies with the group that Greg Meyer led for his PhD project in our lab. And Greg is a very, he's an athletic training PhD. And basically what he said is, Hewett, that's fine. Or he would actually, I think, probably referred to me as nerdo or something like that. Said that's fine if you can show this in a 3D biomechanics lab. But what clinicians really care about is, can we do this in our clinics? So what we did is side by side 3D and 2D biomechanics. So we did the 3D biomechanics in these athletes. And then we side by side just used video, regular 2D video. Like you could, we were using a camcorder, but like you could with your cell phone. And basically showed this abduction load. High forces, high loads, abduction load at the distal tibia, and adduction and internal rotation at the hip, increased loads. And they especially increase loads in high-risk females near peak height velocity. This was Kevin Ford's PhD work in our lab. And this is an algorithm that we developed to predict relative risk. So you can see this is a volleyball player, relatively long tibia. So these levers in the body increase risk. Just physically, the bigger you are, the more body mass you have, and the longer your bones are, the greater risk you have. That's why NBA and NFL athletes are such one of the main reasons. So when you look at this is an algorithm output by the statistical package R. And basically what it does is it says this long tibia that she has gives her 79 points of relative risk. On one side, now this is also important, when there's an imbalance, when there's a difference on one side versus the other, she had 3 centimeters more valgus on the non-dominant left knee than on the right. And that gave her an additional 13.5 points of relative risk. If you look at these rulers, the length of these rulers is the strength of his predictive ability. Knee flexion range of motion, she had a relatively stiff, so harder landing. Again, we're not measuring force on 3D, although we did, but this is not in this algorithm. Knee flexion range of motion, stiffer, less flexion range of motion, 9.5 points. Mass is in every one of our equations. Length, bone length, and masses are in every one of our predictive equations. 71 kilograms, she gets 20 points. She's relatively quad dominant, so this is on a dynamometer. So this is the only thing on here that's not 2D video. It's a she gets 8.5 points, and she is quad dominant. The quad is 1.2 ratio at high speed, higher torque than ham. But as you can see, this is a relatively short ruler, so it's a relatively low prediction power. So we actually can just put in a coefficient variable here to predict the contribution. But with just 2D video, we said this person has a 97% chance of high load. And when we side-to-side measured with 3D biomechanics, we actually showed that her load was almost 50 Newton meters, 48.5 Newton meters, which is double our 25.25 Newton meters cutoff for relatively high risk, nearly double. This work moved forward and was published and highlighted in this topic, which was basically in 2006, we said, where's all the data now so we can reduce the risk of this really important problem? It was the top cited paper in 2006. So then we had an entire county school system that we're tracking, Boone County, Kentucky, where my farm was at the time. And basically what we said was we contacted the district. Interestingly, they had just gone through a Title IX lawsuit. A mother who was actually on the school board was suing the school district because she said her daughter, who was a cheerleader, was not getting equal time, energy, money that football players were. So when we came forward and said, we're trying to figure out this problem, why females are having more ACLs than males. They said, come on in. That sounds great. That sounds something that you're doing. Instead of reacting and saying this isn't politically correct, they said, as we told them, we've shown that we can reduce risk. So they saw this as a positive thing. You're doing good things for female athletes. This is my son, Eddie, and his second grade science fair project. For some reason, I have no idea why, he wanted to study male pattern baldness. And regardless of that, I told him, you don't need to be studying this because it's a non-dominant, it's 50% penetrant, and it is maternally inherited. So blame it on your mom, don't blame it on me. So what we did next was that in this school system, we kept following these same athletes that had these injuries, and we looked in. So the really great thing was we were at Cincinnati Children's Hospital, which is the number one. It's currently the number one ranked children's hospital in the U.S. It's massive, and it's relatively switcher. We don't really we work with everybody, so we were able to get all comers in the region. And what we showed in this next article that won the top cited article in 2010, what we showed is those athletes that had for both males and females that had a first injury, we looked to see who went on to second injury, and we did these prospective biomechanical epidemiologic studies. And basically what we showed here, this is an athlete, male and female combined, that doesn't go on to a second ACL injury. The black line, as you can see, this is the net impulse internally rotating your hip. What this shows is that athletes that don't go on to a second injury are actually in the positive range. So they have a net external rotation moment impulse, externally rotating and abducting their proximal femur. Whereas those that go on to a second injury have a net negative moment. In other words, they're letting the ground reaction force and their neuromotor control reaction to it internally rotate and abduct their proximal femur and therefore abduct their distal tibia and create valgus across their lower extremity. These red boxes are those that went on to significant injury risk. Almost 80, just this inertial impulse alone could predict with almost 80 to 90% sensitivity and specificity who is going to go on to an ACL injury. So finally, where are we going now? We're having this problem with second ACL injury risk in the range of 20 to 40%. Again, consilient data. This was data of another of my PhD students, Mark Paterno. And what we showed when we looked at large numbers of this, patients after 1 year out post ACL injury had about a 20 to 25% risk of a second ACL tear. And then we published that they had a 30% risk after 2 years. Now, the group in Australia, so Kate Webster, Julian Feller, and the other group in Sydney basically reported the exact same numbers, 30%. Now, in Aussie rules football, which is one of the highest risk sports, because basically you've got these athletes going up for these speckies, these spectacular catches, getting their center of mass perturbed. The center of mass drops lateral to the hip and knee joint and causes that moment which abducts the hip, internally rotates the femur, and abducts the distal tibia, and their risk is in the range of 40%. We also showed that at Mayo, female athletes going back to the sport of soccer, 35% risk of the second ACL tear. So again, very consilient data. All that data shows between 20 and 40% relative risk of a second tear in athletes going back to the same sport. So our final step is, where do we go from here? How do we go about reducing this risk? And one of these is looking at new surgical procedures. And that's where we got involved with Dr. Lavender, looking at the fertilized ACL. So there's basically 5 different kind of novel ingredients to these ACLs. And the problem is it's very difficult to look for us to examine point by point on a research basis, which we're trying to do with different randomized controlled trials. But it's basically a quad tendon, all soft tissue quad tendon graft. It's an all inside surgical technique. So the fibia, the tibia and femur are not violated all the way. The drill doesn't go all the way through. It's all internal. Then he creates a putty with the leftover bone and also demineralized bone matrix. And he also takes a stem cell slurry from BMAC, which is bone marrow derived concentrate, that he creates this putty, and into the quad graft, into the tunnels, the half tunnels, he puts in this putty mix in with the quad graft. And so far, it's shown very good short and midterm outcomes. The study is just under review. At the 2-year data is just under review for a journal. It's been in there 2 months, so hopefully we'll hear something soon. So what are our next steps? Basically, we're using virtual reality video. We're using Tracer to look at the biomechanics of return to sport. We're also doing sports plate analysis with Sparta Science. We're using variables with DorsaV, trying to look at what can be predictive for us. And we really think Dr. Lavender is very high on this virtual reality video 3D motion analysis that Tracer can give us. So what we're trying to do is figure out, how do these reconstructions compare? For example, the first study is in bone tendon versus standard bone tendon bone reconstructions, and we're hoping that the next 5 cited top papers of the year in AJSM are gonna come out of these studies. So again, our research approach is at Children's, at OSU, at Mayo, at Marshall, using this pyramid-based approach, starting from the bottom, starting at the base, anatomy, biomechanics, and epidemiology, building up on the anatomic surgical repair, and then with very high fidelity, looking at clinical outcomes to see which are superior. And again, using the data, the literature. For example, about a third of people, and most people don't realize this, this is data that goes back, that was we published in Cincinnati in the 80s, that basically showed there's a rule of thirds. A third of people can go back to sport and function very well without an ACL. A third of people can actually go back to activities of daily living without an ACL. A third of people have to be reconstructed. They're just unstable, period. So we also need to look at who really needs to be reconstructed as well. And again, the final step, tracking with high fidelity and determining the cost effectiveness of using these types of enhanced techniques. Again, short and long-term results, we're at midterm now, and we now have double these numbers. And again, it's also important to look at the long-term outcomes of this. The osteoarthritis, the risk of osteoarthritis is around a third. After an ACL rupture at 10 years, about a third of those athletes are going to have osteoarthritis. So again, let the questions drive the tools, use proper experimental design, and design the experiments to answer the questions so that these are relevant, educable, and most importantly, that they're clinically applicable, that they get out into the clinic. And I think if you use this approach, if you use tools like Tracer, where you can objectively measure movement, you have a good chance of getting this positive changes made into the clinic and with the athletes. And with that, I'll go back to Randy, and I'm more than welcome. Again, I'm somewhat of a Twitter troll, which is now X. So if you want to X me out, come battle me there in that venue, or see me wherever on Please come visit me on YouTube. You'll get a lot of really crazy videos integrated in with science. And again, I'm welcome to take any. I welcome any good questions at this point. So, Randy.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks. Well, great presentation. Yeah, please put your questions into the Q&A, and I want all of your questions to get on here as much as mine. So, but I'll start right off the top. Tim, I'd say let's go. Let's put the rubber meets the road. You got a 14-year-old daughter, and she's she really wants to play soccer. What would you say? Okay, hey, I want to look at number one. Hey, I want to look at this on her to say what is her relative risk. What would you look for? And then what would you say? Hey, I would have her start doing, since you started having your son do plyometrics at the age of 4. What would you do with your daughter, even though you started her at the age of 4? What would you consider to have her do at the age of 14 to say, hey, these are the things that I think I want to risk your injury in general, probably not just ACL, right? Just in general. What would you look?
Yeah, you actually want to start a little bit earlier than 14. So that, again, and I'm going to credit Kevin Ford, who's now a dean. It's what's the greatest thing about being in science and training people in general is when the student far surpasses the teacher. And I can say in almost every case, almost every one of my students has far surpassed me, which is great. And Kevin Ford is one of those examples. He's now a dean at a university. Well, Kevin's work showed, and this was a series of multi-million-dollar grants. We asked the question, who's at risk, and when does risk increase, and how can we target that risk to reduce the relative risk? So in Kevin's PhD thesis was the when question. When does this go up? And so that we know when we should bring the targeted plyometric training. And what he said what his findings was at peak height velocity. So when, again, as I showed, for example, the tibia, the length of the tibia is a really good indicator. So let me just give you a quick analogy. I love fast cars, and basically I like to use car analogies. And basically, boys and girls have similar risks when they're younger. So pre-pubertal, pre-adolescent, boys and girls, even though it's relatively rare, although with all the funneling of athletes and playing kids at higher levels and with more exposure all the time, you're starting to see ACL injuries in younger and younger pre-adolescent kids. It's still relatively rare. It's less than 1%. And in both boys and girls, we think we're doing the studies now, but we think it's probably fairly similar. I'm doing this study with a group in Germany and all the young youth leagues in Germany, and we're asking the question, okay, the first question is, are boys and girls really not different pre-adolescent? And that's ongoing PhD studies. But basically, the idea that here's the hypothesis we're testing. So boys and girls, let's use the car analogy. They start out with a relatively small chassis with a relatively small motor, but the motor and the chassis are matched. So that would be, say, a Prius chassis with a Prius motor. And then what happens, this happens in girls before it, that's significantly earlier than boys, about 1.5 years to 2 years prior to boys. Girls get a bigger chassis. So they go from a Prius chassis to, let's say, a Chevy Malibu chassis, body, longer, bigger, more massive, and they get a match somewhere between a Prius and a Malibu engine. Now, what boys do on average about 1.5 years later is they get an even bigger chassis. So they get a Cadillac chassis, significantly more massive, longer. And what they get, though, is relative to the size of their chassis, they don't get a Cadillac motor. They get a high-end Porsche or Tesla motor. So what do I mean by that? There is significant, even though they're larger relative to their body size, they're actually significantly more powerful. So how do I know that? Well, there's lots of ways to do those studies. We've done them just about every way you can do them. So just something like vertical jump. So a vertical jump is one of the simplest, most straightforward, as we talked about, valid, reliable measures of whole body power. Very reproducible athlete time and time. So basically, what you see in girls is over time, the girl gets bigger, she gets more massive, her center of mass rises off the ground, which, by the way, makes it more difficult to control relative to the stilts that she's on. She stays the same. Her vertical jump height, which is, say, just displacement of her center of mass, is equal pre-adolescent, post-adolescent. And we've done these studies cross-sectionally. We've done them longitudinally over the same athletes over time, and that's what you see. As the girl gets bigger, her vertical jump's about the same. Whereas boys, even though they're taller, bigger, more massive, their displacement of their center of mass, their vertical jump is significantly higher than it was. Primarily, we assume due to testosterone, bigger relative engine. So boys get this motor machine boost, whereas girls tend to have a machine motor mismatch. And that's where we hypothesize that alteration or aberration in neuromuscular control post-adolescent, and that's why we think the risk goes away. Now, again, the good news is neuromotor control is modifiable, and we've demonstrated with our intensive plyometric training programs. Now, I have to admit, again, I'm a powerlifting meathead, and we have been, our training programs have been criticized that they're too much. So we spend an hour and a half, we do 3 days a week, minimum 8 weeks, and preferably once it gets into the season, 1 to 2 times per season. A lot of people say, well, that's too much. They just want to do these pre-practice drills. I don't think you're going to get, the problem is what you're seeing now in these meta-analyses of studies coming out of Australia is the little pre-practice ones don't alter biomechanics and they don't alter neuromuscular control. So if you're going to really get the effect, not only of risk reduction, but performance enhancement, because that's what the coaches and athletes and even parents really want. I mean, sure, they want to reduce relative injury risk, but if they're going to put in the work, they want a better athlete. And then we can show, again, all of our data shows again, over 8 weeks, we can significantly 10 to 15% increases in vertical jump height. And depending on what parameter you look at, 15 to 50% increases of relative power of different body parts. So when you want to do it is right when she hits that growth spurt. That's when you want to do that. And if what you want to do is plyometric jumps, squat jumps, wall jumps, for testing, what I like is drop jumps. So drop jumps are also very reliable. Here's what I love about drop jumps. And people criticize that too. They say, well, that's not real. You don't do a drop jump on the field. So we have to do cutting, this sort of thing. It's not accurate. The drop vertical jump is a really good measure for multiple reasons. Why? Well, for example, if you go out there and you just measure their vertical jump, as I just told you, different athletes, males versus females, jump to different heights. So then if you measure their ground reaction forces from a vertical jump, they're going to be different. And you're going to say, well, this one has a higher ground, this male has a higher ground reaction force, so he's at greater risk. And you say, well, that's because he jumped higher. So the nice thing about a box drop test, a box drop vertical test, is you're dropping up the exact same height. So you can normalize that drop height and your acceleration due to gravity exactly the same across all the athletes. Here's another aspect to it that's really good and really relevant. So if you do it, we actually Greg Meyer came up with this idea using box drop verticals. And because before those first studies we were doing in the early 90s, we were doing volleyball blocks because we didn't want them to go too high. We were going volleyball blocks over a net. He said, let's do box drop verticals because this comes out of the motor control, the athletic training literature. This is old school motor control stuff. If you're doing a box drop vertical, if you drop off a 30.5 centimeter of a one foot height, the reason it was 1 foot is because I went out to the schools. I was looking around for something. We had boxes, multiple different, 30, 40, 50, 60 centimeter boxes in the lab. But I'm scrambling around. I go into the gym. There's nothing I can use for a box. I run into the cafeteria and I find plastic milk cartons. You know how tall those hard plastic milk cartons are? 30.5 centimeters or 1 foot exactly. And they still are. So basically what I did is I took a couple of them, used them as my box drop platform. And here's the thing. If you want to measure someone's neuromotor control, if you drop off a box, if you have good coordination and good neuromotor control, if you don't have that machine motor mismatch that we see in these early pre-adolescent girls, you're going to jump higher than you can on a vertical jump because you're going to utilize that plyometric effect where you're incorporating that series elastic component. So if you drop off a box, 30 centimeter box, you should be able, if you have good coordination, good neuromotor control, jump higher than you can off the ground in a counter jump. On the flip side, if you do have that machine motor mismatch I talked about, you drop down off that box, you're going to jump lower. It's a great, just good measure of neuromotor control. So I would say for those kids, start doing it for that girl do age 11. So it keeps getting earlier. And there's lots of different theories about the different plastics and all the water bottles we're drinking, but girls are hitting adolescence puberty earlier and earlier and earlier. And it depends on average. It's about 10 and 11. So you're going to start around somewhere between age 10 and 12, right just as they're starting adolescence, and monitor them with a box drop vertical test, but also do your squat jumps, do your broad jumps, do your broad hops. This is all, we've got an extent, as you mentioned earlier, over 500 papers of work on this. It's all out there in the literature. It's relatively straightforward. I mean, it's all stolen out of the neuromotor and performance training literature. I took some of it from Don Chu, took some of it from Vern Gambetta, took some of it from all the top athletic trainers out there. We all steal from each other, which is great. So there's nothing magic that we did starting in the early 90s, but you do those plyometrics that are not only going to enhance your neuromotor performance, enhance your vertical jump, make you more powerful, but you use that to screen at the same time. And that's important. But again, that box drop vertical test we use, and most importantly, these tests have error. So what you want to do is they're more important than the absolute number is the longitudinal tracking of the same athlete over time to see if they're getting better, to see if they're staying the same, or seeing if they're getting worse. And this is really important, not only important in that adolescent, pre-adolescent girl, that you're looking at the massive effect of a huge body dynamics change, but also important in that kid who's had that first ACL injury, maybe had an ACL reconstruction, and then is trying to return at lower risk. This, along with the ACL RSI, looking at their psychological profile, also longitudinally looking at that drop vertical jump test and looking at these other plyometric techniques to see, are they improving? Are they staying the same? If they're getting worse, you've got to intervene and you've got to do something different.
Yeah, and that's one of the tests we have on Tracer. So that would be something you'd recommend that we do. You have the people do consistently as just with anybody who's training on there, and also return sounds like. So.
Absolutely, highly recommend.
Good. Well, let's get to some of the audience question answers. So Kevin Cope asked, what do you think is the importance of cognitive reaction time for preparation for return to sport? There's a lot of new data on this, on cognitive processing and movement. And what's your thoughts on your quick thoughts on that? Since we got some other questions we want to get to, what's your quick thoughts on that cognitive, and reaction training?
Very, very important. Greg Meyer introduced this into our training early in the late 90s. I hired Greg at his master's degree at Ball State, and it was 1999, 98 or 99, basically very early on. So when I mentioned using for example, during our plyometric training, we're constantly incorporating perturbations and unanticipated and anticipated movements into our training. So yes, cognitive enhancement, cognitive challenge, all during high level, maximum output, optimal athletic performance is absolutely crucial and needs to be incorporated into both training and screening protocol. Absolutely. And again, this was a lot of Kevin Ford's work too, incorporating into our drop. We have drop vertical jump test, and then we have a screen in front of the athlete that has an arrow, and you can do all with Tracer as well. The same thing. We did it on our own in the 90s. We just put an algorithm where we had they would drop vertical, and then we would point left or right while they were in the air. So before they landed, they had to decide, am I cutting left or cutting right? And then we'd have them cut at different angles, 90-degree angle, 45-degree angle, in this unanticipated fashion in midair. So yes, and Tracer's a good tool to use to do this type of training and incorporation into both your screening and your neuromotor training protocols. Absolutely crucial.
Awesome. How about you give a quick reference of where one of the questions is where I can find some specific training, PT rehab techniques, routine activities for this type of training. Any published any authors you say that?
Oh yeah, the one I really like is we published it right January, December. I think it's 2012. I think we put it in. I think it was accepted in December of 2011. So I did in AJSM. I did the theoretical construct for that, and it was published I think in December of 2011 in AJSM. But the follow-up article, which really gives you all the exercises and a ton of things to do, was done by Steph DeStacy, who was a postdoc of mine at Ohio State at the time. And I think that came out in early 2012 in JOSPT. It's a really good article. Steph's really smart. She's a great PT and a really good writer. And she put that in. And so if you look up DeStacy, DISTASI, and Hewett, and it should be 2012. It might have been, it's either early 2012 or 2011, 2012, I think. Latest it would be it's 2013.
Great. I'm gonna, this one's kind of an in-depth one about certification. We'll go back to that one if we have time. But how about we go down? Can you discuss your opinion on neuromuscular control and relative rested state to fatigue state, and the value to have female athletes in particular do one or work them when fatigued or both? What's your thought on fatigue?
This is a controversial. So it depends. I've been involved in several. If you really want to get in a battle with me on X, throw this one out there. There is a long-standing idea in athletic training, in physical therapy, in I think sports medicine in general, that fatigue causes ACL tears. Fatigue doesn't cause ACL tears. I've got bad news for you. Bad news and good news. So ACL tears, what did I talk about? Moments. So we're talking about forces and we're talking about velocities. ACL tears happen when forces are very high, like when you're landing from a very high jump, or when velocity is very high, when you're backing off and reacting to an offensive player and cutting in an unanticipated fashion, when you tend to be moving at your highest velocities. Fatigue is the opposite of that. When you're fatigued, the definition of neuromuscular fatigue is your force goes down and your velocity goes down. That's not when ACL ruptures occur. If you look at, and we've published multiple studies in, there's one study we published with Matty Bourne, who I'm going to visit. He's at Griffith University. I'm going to be lecturing there. I think mid-February. Yeah, I think on Valentine's Day, I'm lecturing at Griffith University for Matty Bourne and John David Saxby's group at Griffith. Basically, what Matty showed in his meta-analysis is if you look at the relationship between fatigue and ACL injuries, there's no evidence to support it. Now, we did a follow-up series of studies looking at videos of athletes rupturing their ACL that had timestamps on it. And this was a group in Australia that we worked with, and also our own group at Mayo. For example, we looked at all those videos of second ACL tears that occurred. And if anything, there was a bias to occur very early in the match when the athlete was fresh and the forces were high and the velocities were high. Now, there's also the group out of the company's called Kinematics. It's out of it's near Bologna, Italy, and basically they published multiple video reports in Premier League soccer that show the same thing. There's a bias to when athletes are fresh. Now, again, we actually did a series of meta-analyses, and we didn't see an association between fatigue and other injuries, well, like groin injuries, hamstrings injuries. We didn't see that. That doesn't mean fatigue is not playing a role. Fatigue is probably playing a role in, well, I would guess, could be baseball pitchers' injuries, fatigue, more overuse injuries are the ones that are going to be more influenced by fatigue. Something like an ACL injury is not caused. An ACL injury itself, I can tell you that the preponderance of the evidence does not show fatigue in ACL.
Okay. Good. We got one more question, and maybe can answer this quickly. But it's post ACL reconstruction of the hamstring graft, kind of muscle trephinization. I don't know what that term is, but lateral meniscal partial meniscectomy, volleyball player has gained a hollow space in the vastus medialis. They did BFR, muscle stimulation. They can't fill that gap of the vastus medialis. No issue with range, but aesthetically it's concerning. Could there be a reason why? And do you think will this kind of lack of vastus medialis affect the biomechanical, orthometric movement in the long run? So kind of not having that symmetry of the muscle back.
I can only say this, based on, I'm a research scientist, not a clinician, and based on the research, the data available in the literature, what we know is you cannot selectively train the BMO. That's what we know. So the thing to not do is to attempt to selectively train the BMO, because that's not going to work. So my suggestion is use everything you've got in the normal patient to bring this patient back. Focus, as I said, whole part whole. So start with whole exercises, then break the exercise down into parts and train those parts. And then once those parts become, it's interesting because When you go single part or single leg, you actually enhance symmetry. It seems counterintuitive, but that's what you do. So you're going to do a lot of single leg plyometric training with that athlete, and you're going to see that your expectation is on that involved side, she's going to be significantly worse. But what you do is monitor over time. And if you do a lot of unilateral work, you should be able to bring that up and then go back the whole again, bilateral exercise. But focus on the uninvolved side as well and bring them both up.
Yeah, I think we do that often, and I've really seen this data when we track our tracer data is when you have asymmetry right to left strength and you try to do bilateral stuff, you cannot not shift away. You cannot not favor the stronger leg, no matter how much you cue them, how much you say, well, keep your hips parallel, how much you try. So one of the things I say that I do clinically all the time is I don't let them do any double leg stuff until they have single leg symmetry, because and you don't enhance stability if you don't do single leg stuff and manage single leg first. So
and yet you have to keep in mind too, when you have asymmetry on one side, the body wants, especially at the spinal cord level, the body during movement, simple movements like walking, the body wants the most economical movement strategy. So and that's a symmetrical strategy. So if the one side is aberrant or has a deficit, and it's going to take time to counter that and reduce that deficit in order to create symmetry, it is through spinal level feedback loops. What you get is those aberrations and deficits move over to the uninvolved side bilaterally. So yes, you need to train unilaterally, and you need to monitor and train both sides, both the involved and uninvolved sides separately, and then bring them back together.
Okay. Well, good. I have another 1,000 questions for you, but we've run out of time. We'll have to do it over karaoke and a couple of cocktails sometime in the near future, and maybe we can invite all the people who joined us here to that. That'd be kind of fun. If anybody on here enjoys karaoke, we can put that together. And so
I promise it won't be too painful.
No, it's not painful at all listening to you. Now, when I sing, that may be painful. But
oh, I can't believe that, Randy.
You on the other hand,
well, believe, you gotta believe. That's what it's about.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Hewett,
stop believing, buddy.
Yeah, hey, I think there's a song like that. I think I've heard you do that.
I may have heard one like that.
You made a song one like that at one point. So no, well, thank you for being on, and here's all our contact information, and there's Tim's stuff below. Yeah, I would say enjoy Tim on Twitter, which is now X, but enjoy him on there because it is fun to see him go head to head with other people, and it's enjoyable to listen and listen on in the background and watch him go head to head. It's sometimes he goes head to head with himself too, as he said. And that's what a lot of the stuff is, because we don't have answers. We have questions, and we have what we believe now on the literature, and that literature changes, and we change our opinions. So
I think any good scientist or clinician should argue with themselves at least on a daily basis.
Exactly, and I know I definitely do. I question myself every day, so it's good. So well, we appreciate it, and we have more of these upcoming presentations and from Tracer. Look for the ones coming up in the future. We have other ones that we have on their landing pages, previous ones we've done on, children with the autistic spectrum and deceleration with Mike Boyd, and kind of brain processing with, they're right there with, brain processing with Gary Wilkerson. So we've had some good ones here, and we're going to continue to have more of these. So look forward to seeing you all in the future, and thanks for joining us. And Tim, we'll catch up soon. Appreciate it, my friend.
Sounds great. Thanks, Randy.
Okay, thanks.